I did not expect silence to feel this loud. It is strange how a man can build rockets that reach beyond the sky, yet still be brought to stillness by something as simple as a waiting message that is never answered. My son told me about her again last night. Not in frustration, not in anger, in that quiet way a man speaks when he is trying to convince himself that patience is still a virtue. He said, "She will reply when she is ready," but I could hear what he did not say. He is waiting, still waiting, and I have learned, over many decades, that waiting in love is never just waiting. It slowly becomes doubt, if it is not met with honesty. Before I go any further, I want to ask something of you, the one listening to me right now. Just 5 small things, but they matter more than they seem. If this story touches something inside you, take a moment to like this video. If you believe in honest conversations about love, subscribe to this space. Tell me where in the world you are hearing this from. Tell me what time it is where you are right now. And if there is someone in your life who needs to hear a message about love and truth, share this with them. I am not asking because it helps anything beyond what we are doing here. I am asking because connection, even in silence, is still connection. Now listen carefully, because what I am about to say is not coming from speculation. It is coming from a place I know too well. A place where love begins to lose its shape when communication becomes uncertain. My son does not speak about her the way he used to. Earlier, there was clarity in his voice, even when he was uncertain. Now, there is hesitation. And hesitation in a man like him is not a small thing. It means he is carrying thoughts he does not fully trust anyone with. Not even me, especially not me. He showed me a message once. Just one. It was left unseen. No reply after that. He laughed while showing it, trying to make it sound insignificant. But I have been married. I have loved. I have lost. I know what men do when something matters too much. They pretend it does not. And what worries me is not that she has not replied. People get busy. Life gets heavy. Distance creates silence. I understand all of that. What worries me is what silence does when it becomes a pattern, when it becomes a habit, when it becomes a quiet message of its own. Tell me something honestly, just between you and your own thoughts. Have you ever waited for someone's reply and slowly started feeling like maybe your presence is optional in their life? That is where the danger begins, not in rejection, but in uncertainty that is never resolved. My son is not a man who fears hard work. He does not fear pressure. He has lived his life inside expectations that would break most people. But emotional uncertainty, that is different. That is where even the strongest minds begin to question their own worth in someone else's silence. I told him once, not as a father trying to guide a child, but as a man speaking to another man, do not give unlimited space in your mind to someone who gives limited space to your presence. He did not like hearing it. He did not argue. He simply went quiet. And sometimes silence is disagreement without courage. But there is another layer to this, one I have not told him fully. Because I am still watching, still trying to understand her. There are women who do not mean harm, but still create confusion. They are not cruel, they are not dishonest in the obvious way, but they are not clear either. And unclear love is one of the most exhausting things a man can endure. I have seen patterns like this before. A man reaches out. A woman responds when it suits her rhythm, not his reality. And slowly, without anyone noticing, the emotional balance shifts. One person starts hoping, the other starts deciding. And hope, when it is one-sided, becomes a heavy thing to carry. What I fear is not that she will leave him. Leaving is simple. It ends the waiting. What I fear is something far more subtle. That she will remain just close enough to keep his hope alive, but distant enough to never fully choose him. That kind of space destroys more than absence ever could. He told me she smiles differently when they are together, that she understands him in ways others do not. I heard the softness in his voice when he said it. That softness worries me more than any failure he has ever faced in business or ambition, because ambition can recover from loss. The heart does not recover the same way, and yet I find myself asking something I cannot ignore. Is she building a future with him, or is she simply enjoying the feeling of being part of his world without committing to its weight? There is a difference, a very dangerous difference. Tell me, have you ever loved someone who made you feel special in moments but uncertain in future? Have you ever felt chosen in fragments, but never in full? My son believes in clarity. He always has. But love has a way of testing even the most structured minds. It introduces chaos where logic once stood firm, and I can see it happening to him, slowly, quietly, not as a collapse, but as a drift. Last week, I noticed something small but unsettling. He checked his phone more often than he spoke in conversation. Not constantly. Just enough to reveal anticipation. And anticipation, when it is unreturned, becomes a form of emotional erosion. I asked him, "Are you all right with this?" He said yes, too quickly. That is how I knew he was not. What I did not tell him is that I tried in my own quiet way to understand her better, not to judge her, but to understand intention, because intention is everything in love. Without it, even affection becomes unstable. And what I found, or perhaps what I did not find, has left me with more questions than answers. Enough questions that I cannot yet tell my son everything I feel, not because I want to protect her, but because I am not yet certain what I am protecting him from. But I know this much. A man like my son does not wait forever without a cost. There is always a moment when waiting changes shape, when it stops being hope and starts becoming a decision, and I fear that moment is closer than he realizes. Because the last thing he said to me before leaving my study was not about love or marriage or future. It was one sentence I cannot stop hearing in my mind. He said, "What if her silence is already her answer, and I am just refusing to read it?" And I did not know how to respond, not because I had no answer, but because I am not sure he is ready to hear what I am beginning to understand about her intentions, and what that might mean for everything he believes about love. There are moments in a man's life when silence stops feeling like distance and starts feeling like information. I have learned that slowly, not through theory, but through experience that left marks deeper than any success could ever erase. And this situation with my son, it has begun to feel less like a waiting game and more like a pattern that is trying to reveal itself, if only I am willing to see it clearly. He came to me again, earlier than I expected. He did not sit this time. He stood near the window, as if conversation itself required an escape route. That is what love does when it is uncertain. It removes comfort from stillness. He said her name once, then paused for a long time, as if even saying it too freely might change its meaning. Then he told me, she replied, not with clarity, not with warmth that settles the mind, but with something in between. A message that exists, but does not arrive emotionally. I was busy, he said, repeating her words as if trying to translate them into something more reassuring. And I watched him carefully, because I have seen men rebuild entire emotional realities around phrases that do not actually hold weight. Busy is not a problem. Absence is not a problem. The problem begins when busy becomes the only consistent explanation for inconsistency. I asked him a simple question, not to challenge him, but to anchor him. Does she ever meet you where you are emotionally, or only when it is convenient for her world? He did not answer immediately. That pause told me more than anything he could have said. There is a dangerous stage in love where a person begins to adapt their emotional expectations to match inconsistency. They stop asking for clarity because they are afraid of what clarity might remove. And I could see that happening in him, not dramatically, not loudly, but in subtle adjustments. The lowering of expectations disguised as patience, the acceptance of uncertainty disguised as understanding. And what makes this more complicated is that I do not believe she is aware of the effect she is having. That is the part that unsettles me the most, because intention and impact are not always aligned in love. Some people create emotional instability without ever intending to harm anyone, but harm does not require intention. It only requires repetition. Later that night, I found myself thinking about my own past, about the first time I learned that love can be uneven even when it is real. I remember a relationship where everything was present except consistency. Moments of closeness that felt like certainty, followed by stretches of emotional distance that made me question whether I had imagined the closeness at all. That kind of rhythm is not sustainable. It does something to the mind. It makes a person start negotiating with themselves instead of the other person. You begin to say things like, maybe I expect too much, or maybe this is just how they are, when in reality, what you are doing is adjusting your emotional self-respect to fit inside someone else's limitation. And I fear my son is beginning to do that. He told me something that stayed with me longer than I expected. He said, when she replies, it feels like everything is fine again. But when she disappears, I feel like I am starting over every time. That sentence, that cycle, it is not love in its healthy form. It is emotional reset without resolution. It is connection without continuity. And no human being can build stability inside that pattern for long. Have you ever felt that? That relief when someone finally responds, followed immediately by the fear of when they will disappear again? It is a quiet kind of instability that most people cannot explain, but they live inside it anyway. I tried to bring him back to something more grounded. I told him, pay attention not to how she makes you feel in moments, but how she makes you feel over time. Because love is not measured in emotional spikes, it is measured in emotional consistency. He looked at me then, and for a brief moment I saw frustration in his eyes. Not at me, but at the possibility that what I was saying might be true. That is the hardest part of watching someone you love in emotional uncertainty. They do not resist because they do not understand. They resist because understanding would require change. But what I have not told him yet is that I have begun noticing something else. Something more subtle, but far more concerning. There is a pattern in how she engages. It is not absence alone. It is selective presence. She appears most when he begins to withdraw slightly, as if sensing distance and restoring proximity just enough to reset the emotional balance. Then, once stability returns, she steps back again. It is not obvious manipulation. It is something softer, something almost unconscious, but it creates a loop. And loops are dangerous in emotional systems. They prevent resolution. They create dependence on emotional fluctuations rather than emotional certainty. I have seen this before in different forms. Not always in romance, sometimes in friendships, sometimes in families. But the structure is always similar. One person becomes the emotional constant, the other becomes the emotional variable. And I do not want my son to become the constant in a relationship where he is the only one maintaining emotional continuity. I asked him something I did not plan to ask. It came out of me before I could filter it. If you stopped reaching out tomorrow, do you believe she would notice in a way that reflects your absence, or just your convenience? He did not answer, but his eyes changed. That is when I knew he had already considered the possibility before I asked it. There is something I must admit here, even if it makes me sound less certain than I usually appear. I do not fully trust what I am seeing yet. Not because the signs are unclear, but because love has a way of distorting interpretation. I have lived long enough to know that even a wise man can become biased when it comes to his own child's emotional life. So I have been careful, observing more than speaking, listening more than concluding. But I did something else, quietly. I asked a mutual acquaintance a simple question about her patterns in relationships. Not accusations, not judgments, just history. And what I heard was not alarming in a dramatic sense, but it was consistent in a way that made me uneasy. A pattern of closeness followed by distance, interest followed by withdrawal, engagement followed by emotional ambiguity. Nothing extreme enough to be labeled as harmful on its own, but together it forms something that cannot be ignored. And now I find myself in a position I do not like, because fathers are not meant to become investigators of their son's love life, but they are also not meant to stay silent when something feels structurally unstable. The hardest part is not what I have learned, it is what I have not yet told him, because if I tell him too early, I may destroy something that is still developing. But if I wait too long, I may allow something to root itself too deeply to remove without pain. And there is one more detail I cannot ignore. He is beginning to change around her, not in personality, but in emotional posture. He is becoming more careful with his words, more measured with his expectations, more hesitant to express need. That is not love growing. That is love adapting to uncertainty, and adaptation, when repeated long enough, becomes identity. Last night, I saw him staring at his phone longer than usual, not waiting for a message at that moment, but waiting for the possibility of one. And I realized something I did not want to admit. This is no longer just about whether she replies. It is about what kind of man he is becoming while waiting. And I am now afraid that the real decision is not being made by her at all. It is being shaped silently inside him. Because just before he left my study again, he said something different this time, something quieter, almost detached. He said, "Maybe I am not waiting for her reply anymore. Maybe I am waiting to see how much of myself I lose before she notices. And when I heard that, I understood something I was not ready to face. There is still something about her I have not fully uncovered, something that may change not only how he sees her, but how he sees love itself. I have watched many kinds of waiting in my life, but there is a particular kind that changes a man from the inside without him noticing it happening. It does not arrive like disaster. It arrives like routine, like checking a message that was never promised but still expected, like rereading silence until it starts to feel like meaning. My son came to me after that conversation in a different state, not broken, not angry, something more complicated than both. He looked composed on the surface, but there was a distance in him I had not seen before. The kind of distance that forms when a person starts negotiating with their own feelings instead of expressing them. He said her name again, but this time it sounded different in his mouth, less hopeful, more uncertain, as if the word itself had begun to lose its direction. She replied, he said, but there was no relief in his voice anymore, only continuation, as if the reply itself no longer solved anything. And I understood then that something had already shifted, not in her behavior alone, in his interpretation of it. This is what people misunderstand about love. They think the other person changes everything, but more often it is the waiting that does the changing. I asked him, what did she say this time that made things clearer for you? He paused, a long pause, and then he said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. Nothing clearer, he admitted, just enough to keep me from walking away. That sentence carries more truth than most declarations of love ever do, because sometimes what holds a person in place is not connection, it is incompleteness, a loop that never closes fully, so the mind keeps returning to it, hoping the next moment will finish what the last one did not. I leaned back in my chair and said nothing for a while, because I was beginning to see the shape of this situation more clearly, and it was not simple enough to respond to quickly. There are relationships that fail loudly, and there are relationships that continue quietly, while slowly dissolving the people inside them. I asked him something I already knew the answer to, but needed him to say aloud. Do you feel chosen, or do you feel available? He did not respond immediately. His eyes lowered slightly. That was enough. Because there is a difference between being chosen and being kept. Chosen is clarity. It has direction. It has finality in emotional terms. Kept is uncertainty with presence. It is being close enough to matter, but not secure enough to rest. And I could see now that he was beginning to live inside that second space. What I have not told him yet is that I have been thinking deeply about her role in this pattern. Not as an enemy, not as someone with intent to harm, but as a person who may not understand the emotional architecture she is creating. There are people who enjoy attention without realizing they are distributing instability. They respond when it suits their emotional moment, not when it is needed for relational continuity. They step away when things feel steady, not because they intend harm, but because consistency does not stimulate them the same way uncertainty does. And the problem is not that they are cruel. The problem is that they are inconsistent without awareness of consequence. But consequence always arrives eventually. My son is not a man who asks for much. That is what makes this more serious, because men like him do not react dramatically when they are uncertain. They internalize it, they rationalize it, they turn emotional instability into intellectual patience. He told me something that made me quiet for a long time. When she is present, I feel like I understand everything. When she is gone, I feel like I misunderstood everything. That is not romance. That is emotional instability disguised as meaning. And I told him carefully, a relationship that makes you question your perception of reality every time it goes silent is not giving you love. It is giving you interruption. He did not argue, but he also did not agree. That is another stage I recognize. The stage where truth is heard but not yet accepted. Later that evening, I did something I do not usually do. I reviewed not only what I knew, but what I had been avoiding interpreting too directly. Patterns of timing, patterns of response, the rhythm of engagement. And what emerged was not dramatic, but it was consistent enough to matter. She does not disappear entirely. She does not commit entirely. She exists in a middle space that keeps emotional attention alive without anchoring it. And I realized something I did not want to admit. This is not just about whether she loves him. It is about whether she understands what she is creating in him. Because love that is unclear does not stay neutral. It transforms the person experiencing it. And I am beginning to see that transformation. He is becoming more self-contained emotionally, but not in a healthy way, not in strength. In caution, he is beginning to expect less in order to avoid disappointment. That is not maturity. That is adaptation to inconsistency. And adaptation, when emotional, always has a cost. Tell me something, honestly, if you can. Have you ever started expecting less from someone not because you stopped caring, but because caring too much was hurting you? That is the beginning of emotional withdrawal while still being present. I asked him one final question that night. If she never changes, can you still remain unchanged inside this? He did not answer, and this time I did not expect him to, because I already knew the truth he was not ready to say. No one remains unchanged in a relationship where certainty is never offered. And what I have not told him yet, what I am still holding back, is that I believe this situation is approaching a point where silence will no longer be passive. It will become a decision, not from her, from him. Because there always comes a moment in a man's life when waiting stops being love and starts becoming self-erasure, and I fear that moment is already forming in him. The last time I saw him before he left that night, he stood at the door longer than usual, as if leaving required negotiation with himself. Then he turned back and said something I did not expect. "She does not ignore me," he said quietly. "She just never fully arrives." And in that sentence, I heard the beginning of clarity. But clarity does not always bring peace. Sometimes it brings the realization that love was never absent. It was incomplete, and incomplete love is the hardest kind to leave, because you are not walking away from someone who hurt you. You are walking away from someone who never fully became real in the way you needed them to be. And as he walked out of my study, I realized something I am not yet sure how to tell him. This may not end with her choosing him. This may end with him finally choosing himself. And what comes after that, I am not certain I am prepared to see. I have lived long enough to understand that love does not always fail in dramatic ways. Sometimes it simply fades through unanswered moments, through delayed responses, through words that arrived too late to matter in the same emotional space they were needed. When my son left my study that night, I did not stop him. Fathers learn eventually that not every truth should be spoken at the moment it is discovered. Some truths need time to settle inside a person before they can be carried without breaking something fragile. The house became quieter after he left, but not peaceful. There is a difference. Peace is when everything feels resolved. Quiet is when everything is still unresolved, just no longer being spoken aloud. I sat there for a long time, thinking about what it means to wait for someone who does not fully arrive in your life, even when they are technically present. I kept returning to his words. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest in a way that only emotional exhaustion can produce. He said she does not ignore him. She just never fully arrives. That sentence stayed in my mind like something unfinished, like a door left slightly open in a cold room. I thought about her not as a figure to judge, but as a human being moving through her own emotional rhythm, perhaps unaware of the weight she was placing on someone else's heart. I have learned that most emotional damage in life does not come from intention. It comes from misalignment. Two people moving with different definitions of closeness, both believing they are being fair, both unknowingly creating imbalance. But understanding that does not remove consequence, because my son is not someone who experiences love lightly. He does not treat it as entertainment or passing comfort. For him, emotional connection becomes structure. It becomes something he builds internal order around. And when that structure becomes inconsistent, it does not collapse loudly. It slowly reshapes him. That is what worried me most. Not heartbreak, not rejection, but reshaping. There is a version of a man that forms when he learns to expect emotional uncertainty as normal. He becomes more careful with desire, more restrained with trust, more controlled with expression. On the surface, it looks like maturity. But inside, it is often just caution disguised as strength. I have seen men become distant not because they stopped loving, but because they loved something inconsistent for too long. That is what I feared I was witnessing. A love that was not breaking him in one moment, but slowly teaching him to reduce himself in order to keep it. Later that night, I walked through the house and noticed small things I had not paid attention to before. His phone left face down, even when it was not ringing. The subtle habit of checking notifications without opening them fully, as if preparing himself for disappointment in advance. These are not dramatic behaviors, they are quiet adaptations. And quiet adaptations are the most dangerous kind, because no one interrupts them. They simply become personality. I thought about calling him, but I did not. Instead, I wrote a message and deleted it 3 times before sending nothing at all. Sometimes silence is also a form of respect, especially when someone is already overwhelmed by emotional noise inside their own mind. But before I ended my night, one thought returned to me again and again. What happens when someone finally realizes they are not waiting for love anymore, but waiting for clarity that never arrives? That moment changes a man more than heartbreak ever could. Because heartbreak ends connection. Uncertainty prolongs it, and prolonged uncertainty teaches a person how to stay in places that do not fully hold them. The next morning, I saw him briefly. He looked different in a way that was not immediately visible to others, but a father notices. There was less anticipation in his expression, not absence of feeling, but a quiet resignation forming at the edges of it, as if something inside him had started accepting a truth he had been resisting. He did not mention her. And that, more than anything, told me everything I needed to understand about where he was emotionally standing. There is always a point where silence between 2 people stops being communication and becomes confirmation. I do not know what she will decide. I do not know if she even realizes what is unfolding on the other side of her inconsistency. But I do know this. My son is approaching a moment where waiting will no longer feel like loyalty. It will feel like self-abandonment. And no man, no matter how patient, remains in that space forever. As I sit here now, I realize something I have never said out loud in this way before. Love is not only about finding the right person, it is also about not losing yourself while trying to be understood by someone who has not fully decided to understand you. And I think my son is standing exactly at that edge right now, between holding on and finally realizing that holding on too long can become its own form of loss. Whatever happens next will not simply be about her response. It will be about his decision. The moment he stops measuring his worth by someone else's availability, and when that moment comes, whether she returns or not will no longer be the defining factor of his emotional world. Because the most important shift will already have taken place inside him. He will no longer be waiting to be chosen. He will begin choosing what does not require him to disappear in order to be loved.